the construction project outside my house doesn't start up again, I may try and move to a nicer location.
Okay. All right.
Or grind the street in front of my house just about 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, okay. Noisy, huh?
Very.
Yeah.
But I'd rather be on the front porch, and if they're not going to come back, then I might go outside.
Yeah, it's very nice outside. We need one more for quorum, and we need Aiden. I had to do a Zoom update, so possible that other folks are having to do that as well. I don't think I see any members in. Oh, there's Aiden. Could you please move Aiden over to a panelist? Ariana?
He should be rejoining right about now. There he
Okay,
goes.
there's Aiden. One. We still need one more for quorum. Oh, here comes Pepe, so that would be a quorum. Hey, so we'll call the September 4th, 2024 meeting of the Transportation Commission to order. Ariana, if you'd please read the instructions.
Welcome to our virtual meeting. We are going to cover a few basic items before beginning. If you lose connection at any point during the meeting, you can reconnect by clicking the link or calling the number in your original email. To members and city staff, members, if you are able, please activate your video and keep it on for the duration of the meeting. Staff, if you are able, please activate your video when you are speaking. Use the raise hand feature when you'd like to be recognized to speak or ask questions. Staff, click raise hand when you are asked a question. The chair will do their best to call on committee members in the order in which hands are raised. Lowering your hand will take you out of the queue. Members of the public who have registered to speak, the name you entered in Zoom must match the name you entered in registration. You will remain muted until called upon. The clerk will tell you when your time is up. After speaking, a member of the body may ask you a question. If you need to share documentation with the commission, please send it to the email listed on today's agenda. Chair, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ariana. Aiden, if you'd call the roll, please.
Sure. Juliana Bennett. MGR Govindarajan, who said he might be late today.
Yeah, he's traveling, so he may or may not be able to be here.
Dina Nina Martinez Rutherford, who also said she might be joining later on. Barbara Harrington McKinney. Ann Kovich.
Here.
Robbie Weber.
Here.
Denise Jess is excused. Pepe Barros.
Here.
Darren Wozniewski.
He's waving at us.
I'm here. I couldn't get the unmute button to come off the phone.
Okay. Sure thing. Chris McCahill.
Here.
Bill Bremer is excused. And Harold Kleems.
Here.
I have that we just have 6 people here, which is exactly quorum. So if anybody leaves, we will not have quorum. So hopefully, unless somebody else comes. So hopefully you're all able to stick with us. And Darren, you might have to stick with us on your phone because if you leave, we won't have a quorum. So everybody have an opportunity to look at the minutes from the last meeting. If so, we need a motion to approve. Robbie?
Move approval.
There's a motion. Is there a second? Chris?
Yeah, second.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. Any discussion? Okay, I'm going to assume a unanimous consent vote unless anybody wishes to vote no or abstain. Okay, seeing no hands, the motion is carried. We had a lot of written comments under item number 1. But do we have anybody registered to speak under item 1?
No, we do not.
Okay. Do we have, so there's a lot of good, and we got those sort of late in the day, so there's a lot of interesting things to look at in there. So hopefully everybody has an opportunity to take a look at that. Any disclosures or recusals this evening? Okay, seeing no hands. I'm just checking to see if any other members are under attendees. Nope, don't see anybody. We have 2 items proposed for the consent agenda. Do we have anybody registered to speak on either item 2 or 3?
No, we do not.
Okay. Does anybody wish either of those items to be separated from the consent agenda? Okay, seeing no hands, and I see Alder Harrington McKinney joined us. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have 7 now. Alder Harrington McKinney?
Just a point of order. I see that there's an MPO meeting scheduled at the same time, so let me switch over and find out what time that meeting starts, but I'll be back to this meeting.
Okay. Yeah, we only have, you're the 7th person, so we're like on the borderline of quorum. So just, we'll watch for you to come back. Are you going to leave then, or?
No, I'll just check on my phone. I'll stay present.
Okay, thank you so much. All right. Okay, so we have on the consent agenda, we have item 2, Legistar 84634, and item 3, Legistar 84703 proposed for the consent agenda. Do we have a motion? Harold?
Move approval.
Is there a second? Darren?
Second.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. Any discussion at all? Okay, going to assume a unanimous consent vote unless anybody wishes to vote no or abstain. Okay, the motion is carried. All right, so we will move on to item number 4, review of the Metro Transit annual financial audit. And Jody Dobson is here from Baker Tilly. Welcome, Jody.
Thank you. Oops. I can do that.
Oh, excuse me 1 second, Jody. Ariana Alder Martinez Rutherford is in the attendees. Could you please move her to the panelists? That seems to happen to all of us when we have these Zoom updates.
Yeah, she should be moving over now.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for having me here tonight. As said, my name is Jody Dobson. I am the principal who oversees the annual audit for Madison Metro Transit, and just wanted to provide kind of a closure on this year's audit. I think you received 2 documents in the packets. One is the full financial statements, and the other is a slide deck of highlights. Would you like me to try to share that here if I have ability?
Sure, that would be great.
Let's see.
I assume as a panelist, she should be authorized to share.
Yep, that's correct. There should be at the bottom of the screen a little share button. Perfect.
Okay, hopefully you're seeing this now.
We are. Thank you.
So what I wanted to walk through is just really an overview of the audit process, the required communications, and then answer any questions that you might have. Introduction again, myself is the principal overseeing. Ryan O'Donnell served this year as our concurring reviewer. We always have a second person who does kind of a cold review of the financial statements at the end of our process, who's not involved in the audit at all, but gives us kind of a fresh read on, does the financial statements read clearly and is everything concise and consistent. And he's a director with our team, has been with the firm in the public sector team for a number of years. And then Megan Cahill continues to serve as the manager overseeing the audit. So as far as the audit process, we start with understanding your organization's processes, types of transactions, and the controls for processing that data. And this really lets us understand how the information is gathered for the financial statement reporting process, how it gets into your systems, and then is the basis for how we design our audit procedures. We're doing first a risk assessment, where the highest level of risk is something that could go wrong in the financial statements, and then how do we want to address that, or how do we want to obtain evidence to support those numbers? And that can be through a number of different items. We can use confirmations, analytics, test of controls, tracing to source documentation, etc. Ultimately, our goal is to be able to issue our audit opinion and have enough evidence to support that. So the statements this year for Metro received what we call a clean or an unmodified opinion. That's the highest level of assurance that we can give, and lets you know that the financial statements you received are a fair presentation in all material respects of the financial position and the results of operations for the year. That opinion that goes on the statements is really what we're hired to provide based on our audit tests. All of the information in the statements comes out of your records. That's information that's in the general ledger system and processed through either Metro or the city, depending upon the area. I do always like to point out that there's a management discussion and analysis at the beginning of the report. This is really a great summary of the key financial and operating results, tables, narrative, etc. for the year. So if someone wants to have an understanding but maybe doesn't want to get into all the details that are in the financial statements, that's a good place to look. And then I also want to note that citywide, there is what's called a single audit completed related to the receipt of federal and state funding. That report is required to be issued at a citywide level, but Metro Transit does receive significant federal and state funding, and those programs are tested as part of that process, and there were no compliance findings identified for those programs. So a couple highlights here, and I apologize if these are a little small. I'm not sure if I can make them there a little bit bigger. The first one here is just looking at the operating revenues over the last 5 years. And so we can see here for 2023, total operating revenues did increase over the prior year. And when we look at the mix of items here, we saw an increase in federal grants coming in, and that's due to some of the special projects that were going on, and then a pretty stable level of state funding. And then the offsetting decrease is a little bit less proportionately coming from the city and local because of the increase in federal. And as you can expect, we see a similar increase when we look at expenses because of the way Metro's finances work. Many of the revenues are driven by the expenses of the reimbursement grants or proportionate shares. As expenses fluctuate, so do the revenues. The other thing here that's fairly consistent is that the largest cost driver for Metro continues to be salaries and benefits. And that's consistent with every transit organization we work with. It really is a labor-intensive operation. So as far as the required communications, as I noted, our responsibility is really to be able to conduct the audit, to obtain sufficient evidence to meet the standards and issue the audit opinion. The other information comes from your records and is the responsibility of management. They're establishing the day-to-day procedures for documenting and gathering the information and processing it. But obviously, your group establishes some of the policies that go into that and has the ultimate oversight. As far as the audit, there was no changes to the scope or timing of the audit from what was initially planned. We do look at accounting policies annually, and there were no significant changes to accounting policies this year, and nothing that is a concern or questionable accounting policy. Everything was in line with standards. We also look at estimates because all financial statements include estimates, and there we're working to make sure that they are in line with the according standards of GASB. They're consistent from year to year as far as the methodologies being used, and we look at the key inputs to make sure they're reasonable in light of the financial statements as a whole. We do spend a significant amount of time with the financial statement disclosures, making sure that they're meeting all the requirements and they're consistent with the underlying financial statement information. There were no difficulties in the audit. There were no disagreements, consultations with other accountants, or anything of that sort. There are adjustments that are proposed annually, I believe, during some of the year-end items that come up. Nothing there that was unusual or problematic, and everything was included in the statements. There is a management representation letter that is signed citywide, just saying that we've been provided with access to the records and responses to information. And then I do want to note that we make sure that we're maintaining our independence in order to provide the audit. So while we may answer questions for management throughout the year, we're always cognizant of that. The last thing here is I do provide you my contact information. So if you have any questions throughout the year, or as we're starting to plan for next year's audit, you can reach out to me at any time. And I do want to take this minute to thank Metro staff. I know we come in and ask for a lot of information. This year there were some new individuals involved, which is always a pleasure to work with new people, but it can be a challenge when we come in and ask questions and they haven't gone through it before. And so we really appreciate the time and patience in working through all of that with us.
Okay, do we have anybody, thank you very much, Jody. Do we have anybody registered to speak on this item?
We do not, no.
Okay, any comments or questions for Jody? I'm always happy to see a clean opinion, Jody. As a retired banker, I can't tell you how many of these I've reviewed over the years, and this was a good one. So always nice to see. Anybody have any comments or questions? Harl.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. And this is maybe more a question for Justin. So we have this much larger revenue and expenses for 2023, and a lot of it is, I understand, driven by receiving additional federal subsidies. Can you say a little bit more? Is that still the ARPA money that we've now used up? Is that something else? Then I guess thinking about 2024, do we have any idea of what, like, is this going to continue in terms of the size of the budget and the proportion of the various revenue sources?
Sure. So, yeah, the interesting thing about that chart is you notice it starts here in 2019 and then kind of goes down and then back up. Essentially what, during COVID, we cut service and we didn't restore it until December of 2023. So, at least in its entirety. So we saw a couple of years there of reduced expenses. If you draw a straight line of, plus 3% from that 2019 number, it's about where we are now, more or less. And so I do expect to see kind of a normal rate of growth from here on out with that overall expense number. Now that we're back to kind of full service levels. The federal funding was a bit unique. We had the COVID funds from all the COVID relief funds, and we needed to spend them down. We didn't want them to be a target of various places, and so in 2023, we kind of purposefully planned to spend down the rest of our COVID dollars, which reduced the city's subsidy. in 2023. In 2024, we've essentially expended those federal COVID dollars, and so our city subsidy will jump up quite a bit. But again, it's kind of getting it back to where it was in line with 2019 and previous before all those COVID funds came in. More or less, it's not exact, but kind of more resuming the trend line that existed prior to COVID.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the full report at page 10, where the chart goes back to 2009. And I mean, if you look at that, 2023 really still stands out. I mean, the largest we had before was like 57 million or something, and now we're at 67 million revenue. So it does seem abnormal, even looking at the larger time frame.
Yeah, so there were some. Sorry, I was referencing just the ones that she showed in the
right
screen, but so there were some other odd things that happened. It was before my time, but like for example, I think in like 2017, there was a big change at the state level around paratransit that basically shed a bunch of costs from Metro to other Dane County agencies, and so there was like kind of a drop, over a couple of year span there, and so there's various other things at play there, but no doubt this kind of 5-year gap between 2019 and 2024, there's or 4 between 2023, there's a lot of inflation that happened in that period of time, including with our salaries, and that's kind of it wasn't a linear response. It kind of all jumped up in 2023 when we went back to normal service levels.
Okay.
Jody, do you have anything to add?
Thank you.
Thanks, Harold. Other comments or questions? Alder Harrington McKinney, go ahead.
Thank you very, very much. Justin, are we back up to the service levels prior to COVID, and where do we stand? Could you kind of speak to that so I can better understand what those ranges are?
Yes, we are back essentially to the number of revenue hours, which is our primary measure of cost is in hours. And we're essentially back to the number of hours that we were running in 2019. Again, more or less, it's not exact. It's a little bit higher overall for the system, but a lot of that is actually in some of the partner communities have increased their service and their hours. And so it's not that the increase is more from the partners, not from the city of Madison.
Is that all you had, Alder?
Oh, just a follow-up question. So your last statement said that the partner communities have kind of driven that increase. So where are we, if we're just looking at the city of Madison, the Dane County piece, and notwithstanding the partner agencies, so where are we in terms of being back to pre-COVID?
We're essentially back to where we were in 2019.
Okay.
Again, not exactly, but pretty close.
Thank you. I'm complete.
Thanks, Alder. Other comments or questions? Alder Romo.
Hi, everyone. My question is for the Baker Tilly representative. I just skimmed the longer report and I didn't see any highlights or takeaways that for areas for improvement or where we're doing well or, some kind of summary like that. Do you have anything like that you could share with us?
So there is a report that's provided as a city as a whole, because we do audit the entire city, that includes any sort of recommendations or findings. I don't know if that was provided.
It was not.
Okay. So within that, we do talk about, a recommendation just around the year-end processing and financial reporting for Metro, just with some of the changes in personnel that's a kind of a learning curve and getting those processes documented so that they can be better better instituted as transitions happen. I was just going to look to see, I don't see any others that were communicated in here. So,
Okay. If people are interested, perhaps we could ask that be added to Legistar, and then people would have an opportunity to take a look at that. Those management recommendations are also very interesting to review, if you think that's appropriate, Jody.
yeah, I would assume it's been provided to the council, but I guess I don't know the timing on that. So,
Yeah, Justin, maybe you can look into that and see when it might be appropriate timing to share that with TC. That would be the management recommendations, Jody.
yes,
Okay.
the reporting and insights from the audit.
Okay. Yeah, I think sometimes we see those and sometimes we don't. So maybe we can look at that timing. Is that all you had, Alder Rummel?
One more question. In the graph that was in the PowerPoint, it just showed that the passenger revenues are sort of downish since COVID. And I'm wondering if either Justin or Jody can speak to what our expected trends are going forward with the launch of, the new system, or if we know how to make assumptions about trends.
What I can tell you is that passenger revenues are total operating revenues, so that's not grant or subsidies. We're actually up slightly in 2023 over 2022, but the proportion might have been down because of the significant increase in federal funding. And I guess I'll let Justin speak to the future expectations.
Yeah, so we still are not back to pre-COVID ridership levels. We are gaining rapidly. I think over the course of this year, we've, on average, gained about 15% compared to last year. And so we're seeing a strong trend in the right direction, which, opening BRT and launching the new fare system will only kind of accelerate that recovery. Honestly, at the current juncture, I would guess that by 2026, we'll be back to roughly 2019 ridership levels. Fare revenues and ridership are not always correlated linearly. We actually, with the redesign, we've seen that happened a little over a year ago. We've seen about a 15% increase in ridership since then. We've actually seen more like 25% increase in revenue since then. And so, again, it varies a little bit. But what we're seeing is that as people make fewer transfers, that some of that the revenue per ride is going up. Because normally when you make a transfer, that transfer is free. But it counts as 2 rides in our system. So, short answer is I can't tell you definitively, but we're on a good trajectory to get back to where we were.
And one final question, and I'll get off the podium. So we probably all saw some of the recent media, I guess it was in the New York Times, about fare jumping and the kind of fare system that seems like we're implementing. I'm sure you've thought about it, but what can an alder tell the public who might tell us about that article, that what we know that we're doing that will address that, or we know about it and this is what we're doing?
Sure. Well, so I guess first, that article in the New York Times was specifically around bus systems at the MTA in New York. And they have a similar fare system as we've always had. You board at the front door, either I think the MTA and the buses, you still have a MagStripe paper card. At least they did up until a year or two ago. And so very similar to the system we've always had. And the new system in that respect, I don't think will really change anything. It's called fare evasion, where people don't pay their fares, they board. That exists in every system to some extent. And it is in New York, I think, has become a bigger issue because it's not been enforced at all for an extended period of time. And basically there was no checks and balances there. And so people just kind of got into the habit of not not paying their fare. I don't have current data, but we have some, I think, studies from pre-COVID that showed that our fare evasion was somewhere still in around, the neighborhood of 5%, people that boarded without paying. And that is, again, it's old data, so I can't rely on it right now. But, that included people that, their card didn't work, but the driver still let them board, or they did sneak in the back door, or various other problems that they were otherwise able to board without paying. So that exists. It's impossible to prevent entirely, and I would say the new system isn't going to impact that greatly one way or the other. What I will say is that in our business, time is money, and so if we if we park the bus demanding someone to pay, that actually costs us more money than that fare is worth, because that $2 right at $150 an hour or whatever to run our buses, that $2, if we sit that bus for 20 seconds, we've essentially lost that $2. And so we always have to be careful to balance the speed of our service and, basically sitting the bus still with enforcing the fare and finding the right balance there. Obviously, the article cited in New York, they've lost control of that balance, and 40% of the people aren't paying. That's a big problem. But it is something that we have to be aware of in making sure that we maintain that balance.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alder. Pepe, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the presentation. My question goes pretty much in the same direction as Alder Rommel. Actually, one of them was about the revenue expectation, but the other one I have is similar, but regarding the federal subsidies or the revenue coming from federal funding. We see that bump in 2020. We talked about how that was, COVID based, and then in 2023, I'm assuming that has to do with the BRT, big chunk of federal funding that came in. Are we expecting then that fraction of the revenue, the one that is represented by federal funding, might drop for next year, or what will be something that we could expect?
No, so that is actually the remainder of the COVID funds that were expended in 2023. So that will drop in 2024 quite substantially, and kind of get back to more of our historical average of, 6 to 8 million, I believe, in federal contributions to our operating budget. And not to get too far in the weeds, but the challenge, with COVID money, those dollars can be used for operations just straight away. In normal times, which we're kind of back into now, federal funding can only be used on preventative maintenance expenses for our maintenance operation. The federal grants are actually intended to be capital primarily, but the FTA makes an exception for preventative maintenance activities, basically maintaining capital assets. Also qualify for these grants, or at least one of the grant programs. And so that always will kind of create a ceiling for how many of those federal funds we can use in our operating budget.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, Pepe. Other comments or questions? Okay, we will watch for the management recommendations, which will come in the future, but I'd like to entertain a motion to accept the report. Ravi?
Move approval, or I move we accept the report.
Okay, there's a motion to accept the report. Alder Martinez Rutherford?
I second.
And there's a second. Is there discussion? Did you wish to speak to your motion at all, Ravi?
No, thank you.
Okay. All right, any discussion? Okay, I'm going to assume a unanimous consent vote unless anybody wishes to vote no or abstain. So please raise your hand. Okay, thanks very much. And thanks, Jody, for coming. And thanks, Justin, for all the information provided. Okay, we're going to stay on the Metro theme here with item 5, which is an update on the bus rapid transit launch. Since it's so significant, we asked Justin to make some comments with regard to reminders about timing and what all's happening. So go ahead, Justin.
Sure. Well, first, it's good to see all of you again. I know that since Mick has kind of taken the lead for us on these meetings, I haven't seen you all in a little while, so it's good to see you. But I'm glad to give Mick a little bit of a rest. He's been burning the candle at both ends, as I'm sure you can imagine, as a lot of us have been. I, of course, go into the BRT, but just kind of wanted to set the stage a little bit for all of you. Just quite how substantial this next month is for Metro. We are essentially launching 5 different projects that any one of them would be a very big deal for an agency our size in 1 year, let alone doing all 5 of them in 1 month. Between the BRT, obviously, the launching of the fare system, our new technology system, opening a new facility, and launching a third of our buses as new electric buses. All of those things together it's just a monumental task, and our team is working extremely hard to make it all successful and enduring a lot of stress in the process, but are pulling it together to make it happen. So just want to make sure to give kudos to them, and please encourage you to give them the kudos when you see them as well. They are working extremely hard to make this all work. But specifically to BRT and the launch, and so I'll touch on a couple things that are tangentially related. Our new technology system is essentially all installed. We've still got some other future phases of that, but that will really enhance our ability to gather data and kind of our GPS coordinates and on-time performance and ridership in terms of the laser beam passenger counters and camera systems on the buses. Will really enable us to have much better control and data around how the service is performing, as well as making it more successful in the launch. That part of that project is essentially done. There are future phases, but the most important thing is done. The fare system, the new fare system is pretty important, especially as we start boarding at the rear doors with the BRT system. That launched officially on Sunday, September 1st. Since that time, in the last basically 3 days, just to give you a couple stats, we've had 756 people create accounts. We've collected $13,516. We've recorded over 17,000 boardings under the new system. So, a lot of those boardings are based on the new UW passes and things like that. As with any system, there will be hiccups here and there, and we are getting those reports of cards occasionally not working for various people, and we're immediately working through those and fixing them. But overall, the number of reports of those things we've had, versus the over, I think, 60,000 cards we've distributed, I think we're doing pretty well in terms of having a low number of issues. And then this week, also with the startup of school service, we've started rolling out some of the new electric buses in service across the city. One reason being we need the buses. We need the buses in service, and when school service starts up, our what we call peak pullout, the number of buses that we pull out of the garage every morning, goes up by about 40%. And so this week has been a pretty big deal on that front, and being able to roll those buses out helps us meet that pullout. But it also gives us a chance to put some of the buses through a little bit of exercise. Make sure everything's working properly. These are all, hand-built machines that are very complicated, and that we will find things as we put them in service. And that has been true. We've found little things, a door issue here or a seat issue there. or warning light there, various things that we continue to work through, and having this little kind of burn-in period is helpful in finding those issues now when we're running them for 2 or 3 hours a day, rather than when the BRT starts and we're trying to run them for 20 hours a day. So, but that's all going well. It's a lot of work for the staff, but we're getting through it. Our new operations facility at Hanson Road, which will allow us to grow, but also has a lot of the charging capabilities for these buses. That is nearing completion. We have full use of the kind of bus storage and charging areas of the building now. They're just finishing up some of the office areas as well as the maintenance spaces there at the building. But that will all be done and open on September 22nd when we launch the BRT. Construction for BRT itself. So that's all going along according to plan. So we expect the contractor's kind of initial primary deadline for everything west of Stoughton Road. So, the majority of the corridor is actually Friday. There will be a couple things that lag behind on that, namely the Mineral Point widened sidewalk project. That actually won't be done for another couple of weeks. That's a separate project. There's some pavement marking and striping work that will stretch into next week. And then the area along Mineral Point there with the widened sidewalk will be the following week, so before we open. The Orchard Street Station was delayed in its start because of I think it's CDIS, the UW building that's being constructed there. Basically, we couldn't start that until they cleared some of the traffic restrictions on University and Johnson. Otherwise, we would have had those streets down to one lane. And so that delayed start means that station is delayed. That station is going to be a bit of a race to the finish line. We think at this point it will be done by September 22nd, but there is a chance that for a couple days or a week, we may have to use a local stop adjacent to it while they finish up that station. But otherwise, we do expect everything kind of west of Stoughton Road to be done, over the course of the next few days or week. East of Stoughton Road, they've got another 2 weeks or a week and a half on top of that to finish all of those stations and lane markings and everything, which all indications are that should be done. So, all told, by September 22nd, we expect, we believe all stations will be operational with the possible exception of the Orchard Street Station. There will be a few odds and ends, kind of punch list things throughout the system, a lane marking here or a railing there that will still need attention, but none of that should impact our operation. And so, again, it's always a race to the finish line, but we feel pretty confident about where we are and where the contractor is right now. They've got the resources on it they need to get things done, and we feel pretty good about their progress. So on the actual startup of operations, our operations team has been working hard to train all of our drivers. So we've got roughly 275 of our 300-ish drivers done and through the training for the BRT. The remaining ones happening this week or next. We go through every time that there's a service change, we go through a pick process where our driving staff is allowed to pick their new runs based on seniority. That is going, or will be going very soon. Once that is complete, probably by the end of next week, we'll know specifically which drivers will be driving the BRT route. And then that last week before opening, we will give them a lot more time to practice. So they'll be out there on the line in the middle of the day, just on their own, just practicing, pulling into stations, making sure they're getting that routine up, and trying to get that all working well. again, though, the first day of service, having been through this myself in Indianapolis. So, just to give you a frame of reference, in Indianapolis, on a normal Sunday when we opened, ridership was around 20,000 total for the system. The opening day of the Red Line in Indy, we had over 30,000 people on that one route. And so that ridership didn't sustain itself. Like it was a lot of people who were just interested in seeing it because they were excited. But as you can imagine, that level of demand just sank our operation. And so we're trying to do everything we can to prevent that from happening. But the first couple days will probably be a little bit of a slog just to accommodate all the people who are excited to ride. I've actually got videos in Indy of, pulling up to a BRT station that is literally shoulder to shoulder filled with people. There's probably 100 people waiting at this station. And I pan around in the bus that I'm in, and literally the whole bus is already shoulder to shoulder. So that was the level of congestion that we were dealing with. I hope we don't have the same situation here. So I want to temper folks' enthusiasm a little bit to maybe wait a day or two unless they need to ride that day. So, but again, we're trying to put the resources that we have and the training that we can to get people out there and try to put us in the best position we can. But again, it will be, things will not be perfect the first day for sure, or even the first week. So I believe that is most of what I have to share, but again, I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, for those of you who were able to make it out to the tour a week or two ago, I was glad to see you, and hope to. I think we're actually working to schedule one more tour for maybe the 12th for anyone who was not able to make it and still wants to do so.
Great. Thanks, Justin. Do we have anybody registered for this item to speak, Aiden?
We do not.
Okay. Comments or questions for Justin? And I saw Mike Chuckvala here. Yep, Mike's here as well. Anybody have any comments or questions? It's very exciting. So on the one hand, it's really exciting that a lot of people wanted to come out in Indy, but I can understand that that many excited people can cause some issues. Alder Harrington McKinney, go ahead.
I was waiting for Chris to pop his hand up, but I wanted to say to Justin, I took the ride with the Alders and others, I think it was last week, and I was so impressed with the efficiency. And I know that there's been a lot of hard work that went into the process, and your team has been amazing. And so I just want to make sure that we say hats off to you and pass it on to your team, because it's a Herculean task that you've undertaken. But I was so appreciative of riding on the bus, and especially the bendy bus. That was exciting for me too. So again, hats off to you. Tremendous work, and we want you to know that we appreciate the effort.
Appreciate that.
Thanks, Alder. Alder Madison, go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to echo Alder Harrington McKinney's comments that I also took that bus tour, and I'm glad I did take it, because earlier when we used one of the electric buses for our small business tour, the BRT stations weren't up yet for us to check out. But because I took the tour, where now the BRT stations are mostly up, and we got to get on and off and to hear about how the actual station works. I've been able to dispel some myths and some rumors and some wrong information. You don't know how happy I have been to answer questions about how you actually load, about the bikes getting on and off, about how it actually works when there is like an island kind of in the middle, and the bus is loaded on kind of like in the middle of the street, sort of. So I just want to say shout out to everybody who had a hand in the BRT over the years, because from what I understand, It's been multiple years, multiple alders, and just thank you. Thank you to the folks who explained how everything works to us also on the day of that tour, because I have those videos and I have maybe sent 11 people the videos I made and say, hey, I saw you on Facebook kind of sharing some wrong information. Here's actually how it works. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Great work, y'all. Also, shout out to Denise. I think does Denise also serve on this Transportation Commission?
She does. She was not able to be here this evening, but I know she went on the tour and enjoyed it as well.
It was great being able to be on a bus with her too. So thanks y'all. Thanks everybody for your work.
Yeah, thanks, Alder. I had an opportunity to have a private tour with Mick and Denise before the tours that you're talking about, and having the tour with Denise, a lot of great information about things that have been done to make sure that everything is accessible to everyone. So kudos for that. And also the intersection where the BRT station is right outside the Metro Transit office. Wow, that crossing at East Washington Avenue, hugely improved, really, really excellent. So a lot of things that people were concerned about, as Alder Madison was saying, we can show people that they really don't need to be concerned about those things. Alder Madison, go ahead.
Yep, I just have one question. I know at my tour, I was probably just so elated and was talking and didn't hear the correct answer. But I know the box, there's two boxes. One has a little red button where you can push to turn on the heat. And the box right above that red button box, what is that button? I feel like I know the answer, but I want to make sure I'm explaining it correctly.
Yeah, so that's it's called an annunciator. So basically it's for those so there's a real-time sign that tells you visually when the next bus is arriving. But if you can't see that sign, there is a button there that you can push where it will read you that sign audibly.
Gotcha. Okay. Your explanation is way better than what I've been saying. I was on point, but not as on point. Thank you.
Thanks, Alder. Robbie, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I'm super thrilled about the BRT, and I went on the tour and, it explained a few things to me. I kind of had a general idea how it was going to work, but it was great to be able to just see everything in person and actually be able to see how the red lanes work with through and turn lanes on Mineral Point, because I was standing up front so I could see, I was up high enough so that I could see how it all worked. And I was like, oh, okay, well, now that makes complete sense. I wish a lot of other people, specifically all of the Cassandras on Nextdoor, could see the same thing. And I know how hard it is to get information out to the public. Believe me, I've been seeing people ask questions that have been discussed again and again and again and again. But it seems that the people who use Mineral Point Road are very confused about the turn lanes. And I know that there are some lane markings missing, specifically at Whitney and Mineral Point. But I'm wondering if we can do maybe right before the BRT starts, one final push, get an article in the paper to explain how a left turn in conjunction with a red lane works, because everybody is just absolutely certain that, it's going to be the end of the world. Of course, I heard this when we put in roundabouts too. Nobody's going to understand them. Nobody will know how to use them. So I'm sure everybody will figure it out, but maybe it would help to be able to forward an article with a diagram to these people. And so I guess that would be my I don't know why East Washington, nobody seems worried about East Washington. Everybody seems worried about Mineral Point Road. And I'm not really sure why that's such a huge concern. But I guess that's my only comment, but I am confident that everyone will figure it out once it starts working.
Yeah, and I think I guess short answer, some of those animations we've started to work on, or transportation has tried to work on, and Mineral Point will be one of those they will do. But I think you made the point, the markings aren't done, and that's the challenge. And I think we did see a lot of confusion on East Washington when it was just a red square. But once the bus only markings and the solid white lines went in, people seemed to get it pretty quickly. And that's part of the challenge on Mineral Point, is that those markings aren't complete yet. Hopefully they will be pretty soon, except for at least in the eastbound direction. The westbound will be a week or two delayed because of the sidewalk project. But yes, I agree with you. I think the combination of the markings being completed and us doing some of these animations and getting some of the media out there when that happens will really help.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say, I think something that's confusing people is that there seems to be a lane shift. So in other words, there used to be a bus, bike, and right turn lane on Mineral Point, and people just don't know, they don't understand that all the lanes are shifting to the right. And I think the lane markings aren't there yet. And so people just are completely befuddled by this. So hopefully it'll all be over soon.
Okay, thanks, Robbie. Other comments or questions? Again, congratulations, and a lot going on. And, please pass along our thanks to everybody at Metro Transit. Justin, we know how hard everybody has been working, and it really brings it home when you talk about the 5 things that are all going on at the same time here. So that really puts the pressure on, and people have really stepped up, and we're all very excited and very grateful for what's happening. And I think it's meaningful that people are seeing this education happening as people are having opportunities to have tours and understand how it's going. And you have some open houses coming up too, don't you, Justin, that are going to help as well?
Yes, I do not have those dates in front of me, though, unfortunately.
Yeah. Maybe Aiden, maybe you could connect with Mick and get some information about those open houses out to the alders and the TC members, because as Alder Madison pointed out, and other people have pointed out, when we're armed with this information, it helps us better answer the questions that we get from other people. So, and open houses can help answer people's questions directly too. So, Aiden, if you want to connect up with Mick, then we can maybe get that information out, as I said, to all the alders and to the TC members.
And the confusion or concern isn't limited just to the public. Our staff, we've got 500 people, many of which were concerned. How is this going to work? I don't really understand it. Sure. These buses are going to be so difficult to drive. Almost to a person, everyone that has driven these new buses has said they like them better than our regular buses. So that experience, that exposure has really been important at kind of breaking down some of those barriers of fear and the unknown. So
great. Excellent. Robbie, go ahead.
So I just accessed the Metro Facebook page, and the open houses are this Friday, from noon to 3, and next Tuesday, 4 to 7. And both of those open houses are at the Baldwin Street Station, which is, of course, right outside of Metro headquarters.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And Ariana, could you please move Alder Govindarajan from attendees to panelist?
Yep. He should be moving over now.
Okay. All right. Great. Thanks. Welcome, Alder. Again, those open houses are another opportunity for people to get answers to their questions and to see things for themselves if they haven't already had that opportunity. And it's really impressive. So I encourage anybody who hasn't had the opportunity to take advantage of it, because it's really meaningful when you see it in person. So other comments or questions on the BRT launch? Okay, well, again, our thanks and gratitude to everybody at Metro Transit. And we'll keep spreading the word and answering questions to the best of our ability and passing those along to the folks at Metro if we can't handle the questions. So anything else before we move on to the next one? Okay, thanks. Thanks so much. All right, we're going to move on to item 6, which is review complete green streets guide. And I just want to check in. I believe we have 2 people registered to speak on this. Is that correct, Aiden?
That is correct. Yep.
Okay, so we'll hear from Renee first, and then hear from the public, and then we'll move into the discussion. So welcome, Renee. Go ahead.
All right, thanks. I think everyone knows by now, but I'm Renee Calloway, Assistant Director of Traffic Engineering. Let me just share my screen here. It's very, okay. Okay, apparently this new version of Zoom that I just got doesn't like me because it is... There we go. Finally stopped thinking about it. Okay. So I am here. We agreed when Complete and Green Streets was approved back in January of 2023 that we would have a review maybe somewhere kind of in the 18-ish or so months. So we're just a little bit over that. Tonight, I just want to go through some things that the staff team has highlighted. We don't need to approve anything here tonight. Just a discussion, see kind of how you feel about some of these recommendations, things, anything that comes up. There is something in here about trees. Anything that would come up about trees or distributed green infrastructure, we would take to the Board of Public Works towards the end of this month. So then we would come back here after that with an actual kind of updated, the actual guide itself updated for approval. There's some corrections in there that Ann noted, like we still refer to the Transportation Policy Planning and Policy Board, which is no more, so that needs updated. There's stuff in there referencing the need to update the subdivision ordinance, which did happen. So those things would also get kind of cleaned up with the official approval process. Just a little bit on the implementation. So we did a big training back in August of 2023 before this kind of construction season to make sure that everyone in engineering and traffic engineering was feeling good about the guide, understood how it worked. You guys have probably noticed there are a lot of new engineers that have been hired, so it was really an opportunity for them to get up to speed since they were new to the kind of street design process. You have seen here 5 projects where we completed the Complete and Green Streets checklist, projects that have gone through for reconstructions. As I mentioned, at the end of July, the subdivision ordinance was updated to follow the Complete and Green Streets guide. We, I'm sure you remember, had kind of a complicated first project. It did come here asking for a variance. And then we had 4 other new development projects that followed the guide without requesting a variance. I think it was actually just the last meeting when the Northeast and West area plans came here. During that process, the guide calls for them to review the street types, to review the all ages and ability bike network routing. That there were a few changes recommended, not a lot, but those are included in that process. that will go to the council for finalization. So that's kind of, we're still fairly new at this process, just because we don't have an overwhelming number of projects each season. A few things that I want to highlight here this evening. One is that when the guide was approved, we knew that there was this potential to update what we call our equity priority areas, where we have some additional process steps and engagement steps. And the city was kind of in the works of updating the ones that we use. And we also had kind of just a draft all ages and ability bike network. So those are the two things I'm going to talk about a little bit more. First, this is the map that we approved for the initial equity priority areas. It's really just the neighborhood resource team areas that were there at the time, but we wanted to expand that. Now, I think it's important that we align with the city's equity areas. And when you reviewed the transportation improvement program scoring earlier this year, that is using the new equity priority areas. And this is kind of what that looks like. It still includes all of the neighborhood resource team areas, but then has additional census blocks that would be used going forward. This is still in the draft version at the city level. I'm thinking maybe by the time I come back, this might be they might have more of a public facing presence with this. Our data team has been working on it, but they felt like this is exactly the kind of thing that they intended for it to be used for. And I think if we're using it to score in project selection, it probably makes sense for it to also be the areas that we use in the Complete and Green Streets Guide. So I think the staff is recommending that we would switch to using these kind of city-defined areas. As I mentioned, we also just had a draft all ages and ability bike network, knowing that kind of finalizing that would take quite a while. We didn't necessarily have funding or resources for that at the time, so we approved it like this. But we did secure some funding through our Safe Streets for All grant to do further network analysis, do additional engagement, and develop a recommended final map to bring back here. We've gone through our RFP process to select Tool Design Group. They were the top firm. And so that contract is going through the resolution process. I think our next meeting, you'll probably see that on the agenda for approval because it's being introduced at the next council meeting. So that's kind of where that sits. So at this point, we're not recommending that we make any full-scale changes to this until we would work through the process and bring a map back here. That project also, you may remember, has funding to help us prioritize the gaps in the system, which we could then use to feed some of our programs like Safe Streets Madison, like Engineering's Bikeway project. So that is also kind of a component of finalizing the map. We're not really recommending much in the way of street types, but we did receive some kind of feedback that trees aren't really highlighted. And so we thought that that would be a good addition to sort of the boulevard street type to just kind of lift up that this would be the type of street that would feature tree-lined sidewalks, terraces, medians to kind of just make that something that people are more aware of and not have it perhaps buried in the description. So that's a recommendation for the boulevard, just a slight description addition. All right, a lot of focus really, because this is really a guide for implementing projects, has been on these design parameter tables that are at the back of the guide. And we've noted a few areas perhaps that could be cleaned up or just better described. And one of those is we talk about the walkway width in the table. But that has confused some people to thinking that we're saying that all sidewalks would be a minimum of 6 feet in width, when really what we're saying is that the kind of baseline sidewalk would be 5 feet, but there would be buffer space, often a foot, not always, up to the right-of-way line. So we just want to shift that to call it the total walkway zone width. Not sure if that's more or less confusing, but that was kind of what we came up with in talking about that. And then just this table already has quite a few footnotes, but some additional ones that we noted maybe needed to be called out a little bit more. One is that new streets, street dedications would require an 8-foot minimum terrace. So under, no matter how you kind of use the flex zone, anything that's new would need that 8-foot minimum to ensure that we have optimal tree planting space. And then just because there's many ways to measure things, we said that the flex zone would be from face of curb if there's no parking present. When there's parking present, it's a little bit different because it includes some street space, terrace space. But when there is no parking, it seems like we're just quibbling over a very small amount, but we felt that it was better to just be clear. And then we have the typical ADT in 6.1 and 6.2. So we were just going to take it out of 6.1 just to make that table have a little less information in it. 6.2 is the next section, also is a table. It's more focused on roadway design and space allocation. We have had a lot of people try to determine the part that talks about average daily traffic, the ADT, feeling like maybe that's a hard number. If you think the street might be a little bit more than that, you should look at a different street type. So we're thinking we would want to change that to say estimated, just so people feel like it's a little bit more flexible in assigning the street type, especially since our street types are aspirational. So it's what we're trying to create and build, not necessarily what the street is at this exact moment. So I don't know, staff just kind of felt like estimated was a better overall word in trying to talk to people about how street types are assigned. Also, in neighborhood yield streets, there are some occasions, perhaps not the most common design, but there are some occasions when streets don't have driveways. They may have all of the access to it off an alley, but they may still need to meet fire lane requirements, which typically on a yield street, when there are driveways, it allows a fire truck to pull over into that space because there would be no one parked there, so there would be a wider area. But if it's a street that has no driveways, then that can cause a complication for a fire truck to have a spot that they can kind of maneuver through one of these of our narrowest streets. So we were just thinking of footnoting that for those occasions when we might have a street like that. And then in talking to Metro, they just wanted a footnote on a couple of street types that we can have that minimum 10-foot lane, but they need to have some type of gutter. So if we're going to a non-traditional gutter that's narrower, maybe we don't have a bike lane or a buffer bike lane, that they actually need a little bit more space to maneuver. So they wanted to just have a footnote so that designers were kind of taking their needs into consideration as we try to narrow up different types of streets. All right, then we are suggesting that we would add a new section 6.4, and this is one of the items that we would be taking to the Board of Public Works because it is specifically about tree canopy enhancement. And the idea is to just add a little bit more information so that it's kind of clear that how you can enhance that tree canopy and still have other amenities within the flex zone that might be desirable. And I think these are things that you have been seeing in projects that have come forward as we try to preserve trees, as we try to add new trees. But we want to just call that out a little bit more because we want to Also, we have the tree priority areas where we're trying to get more trees planted, but also we're always trying to preserve what we have and improve, not just improve what we see today, but have a situation that would allow us to improve the tree canopy in the long term. So this would be looking at both the now and the future. And one thing that has happened is there's some new city standard specs around excavation and soil that have gone into our city standard specs. So we want to call that out because that is an important addition. And we wanted to pull out some particular kinds of things that might be typical within a project and a different street type, which would allow you to do some things within the flex zone to meet our goals. So that is specifically calling out the idea of a parking reduction or elimination. As you've seen in projects, sometimes we have done both of those. Sometimes we've put in like smaller parking pockets throughout that really takes into account where we need to maintain trees. So it's kind of using the flex zone differently throughout a project. We've done some curb bump outs that you can kind of move the curb out just in some select spots. We have the terrace support system, which you see more downtown, like we have on MLK, that really is in more of a hardscape surface, but is allowing the tree roots to be healthy. We've aligned sidewalks where we might sort of move it one way or another to avoid some tree roots. And then, of course, we also plant median trees where we can. So I think we just wanted to call this out a little bit more to help people understand some of the options that are out there in enhancing our tree canopy and building space in the future for a tree canopy. I think having the flex zone be a variety of uses has proven to be a little bit confusing in some situations. And then this kind of refers back to something that we've talked about previously here, which is a new section 6.5. We had the memo that we came and talked about after our subdivision ordinance passed to kind of talk through some ways that you can align with the guide and also align with fire code. So this is not new to you all. This is something that we came and talked about earlier, but just talks about sort of options, and some of them are, the fire lane does not have to use the street, but also we cannot require things like steel, multiple staircases, sprinkler system due to kind of some of the state guidance that we have. So this is intended to help people understand what they can do if we need to use the street to make this work, but it wouldn't require a variance. So the things would be just a new chart that kind of goes through the things that were in the memo that we went through previously, that would give a variety of different options with paving terraces, rolled curbs, streets without parking, streets with parking, maybe on one side or maybe with angled parking. Sometimes it could be on two sides, but it would maybe have a small island that would kind of differentiate the space, but get you that needed for an aerial apparatus. So this is just taking what was in the memo that we talked about earlier and making it an official section within the guide so that it's really clear what some options that someone could consider. Not that there might not be other options that could come forward, but these are ones to kind of help people see some ideas to make that work. I also would love to hear more about the project checklist. This is something that we did this year, 5 projects. It is a little bit of work. So I think we just want to make sure that it's adding value. If it's something that you're using, so that we can give some thought to if we would want to make any changes. And as we think through how we do this checklist going forward. Who does it? Is it a project manager? Is it one particular person? So far, the first ones I've done, as we kind of thought it gives me kind of a feel for the effort required. And also, we have funding to continue to work on some of the equity and equitable engagement around transportation, how we kind of integrate that across engineering and traffic engineering. And this checklist is a part of that work. And so love to get feedback as we think about how we want to move forward and ensure that we're doing a good job with that component of the guide. So this is kind of just going through what all of those recommended changes are. As I said, not necessarily voting tonight, wanted to get feedback on these things specifically. And you may have things that were on your list that didn't kind of get risen up by the staff team. So this is a good time to take that in so that when we come back, we feel like we're really getting a guide that we can update to meet everyone's needs. All right. That.
All right, thanks, Renee. Why don't we hear from our registrants and then we'll go to comments and questions.
So first we have Sandra Ward of West Mifflin Street, supports and wishes to speak.
Hello. Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I am very much in favor of the new section 6.4, which focuses on the tree canopy with enhancement guidelines I think are so critical. It's very clear that in the past, tree canopy has not received the priority that it should have received on some streets in particular. And I think that what has been written here is going to go a long way toward improving the situation and helping Madison prepare for the future with a canopy that will help shade and increase the health and well-being of all of us. So thank you for your work in this area. I very much appreciate what you've done. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Anybody have a question for the registrant? Okay, seeing no hands. Thanks so much. Who do we have next?
So next we have Gabriel Hill of Presidential Lane, neither supports nor opposes and wishes to speak.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
We can, thanks.
Hi. Hi. So there seems to be a problem with the classification of neighborhood streets, which is item 5.11 on the complete green streets guide, and yield streets, which is item 5.12. The current design standard only really works when the street is fully parked or at least mostly parked. Well, this works in a few neighborhoods downtown, like parts of Greenbush and Tenney, for example. However, the majority of neighborhood streets and neighborhood yield streets in Madison are never fully parked. Thus, the role of traffic calming that the design assumes parked cars will play is never realized. This leads to increased speeding and more calls by residents for expensive speed bump projects. The time when this phenomenon was most clear to me, it was while listening to a Transportation Commission meeting. I believe it was last year, but it was when staff presented a plan to repave and add gutters to an outdated street in the Midvale Heights neighborhood. The plan initially came with speed bumps, but the commission pointed out that this particular street was not on the citywide speed bump installation plan, so speed bumps were removed from the plan. This raised the question, why are we designing neighborhood yield streets that are so wide that they need speed bumps? This street, like many around Madison, has had only a few parked cars on it year round, but was designed with space for parking on both sides. My recommendation to the commission and staff is to shift neighborhood yield street design more towards what the Court Street example looks like in the Complete Green Streets Guide on page 53, only adding a second lane of parking on streets that truly need it. And when that second lane of parking is needed, add flexi posts or curb bump outs every few parking spaces to provide that lane narrowing effect when cars are not present. This would lead to less total pavement, which means less required plowing, lower speeds on neighborhood streets, and a reduction in the need for expensive speed bump projects, all without affecting parking availability for residents in any meaningful way. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much. Any questions for the registrant? Okay, seeing no hands. Is that all we had then, Aiden?
Yep, that was everybody.
Okay, thanks. So comments or questions for Renee? Harold.
Yeah, thanks, Renee, for presenting this. Let me maybe start by following up what we just heard from the last registrant about neighborhood yield streets, because that also has been a bit of my concern, that the concept of the neighborhood yield street with this idea is that two drivers can't pass each other because the street is too narrow, because it is, if there is on-street parking. We seem to be moving more and more away from that when we look at the requirements for fire apparatus access, when there are issues such as, well, there's maybe no parking. And so, yeah, maybe you can address this a little bit of where you see the neighborhood yield street and how can we still have the desired outcome, which is traffic calming, within all these constraints that we are dealing with. And can we do, for example, something like, okay, if we assume there's not going to be regularly parked cars, can we then have curb bump outs distributed throughout the block while still maintaining fire access?
Sure. I mean, I think, the neighborhood yield street isn't necessarily going to look the same everywhere. I mean, the guide is pretty varied, 24 to 32 based on parking. And I think streets can definitely have curb bump outs. I mean, it's definitely one of the many kind of things to consider. I think, we've just started doing projects like that. And I know that we are looking at trying to collect some data as projects are finished up to see if we're not doing speed bumps, we're narrowing, we're doing maybe some curb extensions that are a little bit different than just at the intersections. Are we having those desired outcomes? So I think I don't want to give an answer to say like, yes, those are the solutions, because we have just started doing projects that we think are going to be successful with that type of design, with maybe choke points, curb extensions, like some of those different things are still pretty new to our projects. And our neighborhood yield street does allow a pretty wide divergence in what that width would be. I think we've had good conversations when those projects have come forward. And I think it's no surprise that the parking is a big discussion. If we do studies and say that, oh, we think we should remove parking and do some of that, it is a lot of debate around if what we did is the correct parking utilization. So, but I think that those are some good things and good things to think about. And if we, want to narrow up on the high end of what the max width would be.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one way, it's called the neighborhood yield street, so it has this concept in the name, but then if you look at the text under, it only has this idea, you only get to the yielding through parked cars. And so maybe even being less specific that, okay, this is the concept, this is a street where two drivers can't pass each other. And how we get to that, sometimes that's with on-street parking, sometimes it's by narrowing, sometimes it's with bump outs or whatever else. That's maybe secondary to that. Yeah, I'll come back later, so I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Okay. Chris, go ahead.
Thanks. And thanks, Renee. I'm happy to see the tree canopy section. I think that's something I hear people concerned about and asking questions about a lot. I guess I'm just wondering the extent to which you think the Complete Green Streets Guide can flesh out some of the issues that come up when we're talking about street trees. Like, for example, I seem to recall when it comes to medians, there are concerns about width and maintenance and things like that, and salt maybe. And then in terraces, like I know tall taller buildings, there's concerns about, I mean, I think some of the concerns. So will this speak a little bit to some of that and answer some people's questions, or just sort of a yes, no, maybe?
Maybe. I mean, it's a complicated issue, right? That's why we have a lot of sections in there, like different kinds of trees and different kinds of situations. I don't know. Ian, the city forester, is here. I don't know if he wants to talk about we kind of went through this together. This isn't the end all be all. There's a lot of factors. So I'm going to turn it over to Ian.
Well, that's dangerous. Yeah, I think, Chris, to your point, what recognizing trees in this document does is it just gives us an opportunity to kind of flex on the community's priorities. And so it's not necessarily just terrace width that would do it, but if we're talking about having 8-foot terraces and wanting to prioritize trees, then that's the platform that I use to say, okay, this project requires suspended terrace infrastructure, or this project requires the new soil amendment process. And so that's basically what I would reference for why and how we're going to go about making this plantable space where it might not have been in the future, or same thing, maybe it would be a 4-foot terrace and now the regulations require that it's 8 foot. That's a much better space for me to consider planting in than it previously would have been.
Does that help, Chris?
Yeah. Can I make just 2 more quick comments for Renee, and then I think I'll pass along to everybody else. So just on the section 6.5 on alignment with the fire code, I know folks probably saw that we had a public comment that sort of said, there's wide streets and there's other things developers can do. So I'm just sort of hoping that without going outside the scope of complete green streets, this section could say something to the effect of, this is one way of addressing fire needs, so that folks don't see this and think, oh, this is how we're going to address the needs of fire, is through complete green streets. But otherwise, I'm happy to see these options in here, because I think this was some innovative stuff that that staff came up with. And then the last comment is on the checklist. I think it's probably good that the project team is going through and sort of putting their finger on all the questions in the checklist. But I may have raised this before. I hope it's not too much of going through existing data sets and pulling out pieces of information that already exists somewhere, and at the same time generating new information that isn't going into a data set somewhere. So to the extent that this checklist can align with, can we just pull up an existing dashboard and get the answers to a bunch of these questions, and at the same time feed into those, so sort of creating that feedback loop between the underlying data sets that the city's working off of, if that makes sense. Great,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Alder Rummel, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris, for mentioning the public comment. I was going to raise that as my constituent, so she copied me on the letter about how we address community values. I think that was her angle, and I don't really have an answer other than I just wanted to make sure that you all saw that and think about it, because it seems easy in some ways for developers to use the public, asset as opposed to their own parcel. And so is there a way that we can say, I think Chris's point was like, use it as an approach and here's some options, but, not say it's like, here's the way to do it on the city's dime, basically. So there's that. And then really I raised my hand initially because I wanted to thank you so much, staff, for adding the piece about the boulevards and the whole new section. I know I kind of had a meltdown here at Plan Commission when I learned about Urban Design District 8 with its language about boulevards being 10 feet and then realizing that nothing had ever been approved that was larger than 8 feet. And my head exploded. So I appreciate this. And again, I want to thank everyone for the work, and I will be following it. Thanks.
Thanks, Alder. Darren, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. Renee, thank you for this and these updates. Again, my focus will be on section 6.5 in the fire code, and reiterating what Chris had said. If we can make street design at the very bottom and as a, oh, by the way, we can do this, versus here's some way to address the fire code, because I know it's the fire code. I know that I listened to the presentation that was given to Plan Commission, but still the fact that we're designing our streets and making them unsafe so that fire trucks can get there in one manner of safety and a fire is, and I'm not trying to diminish the safety of a fire, but the death of pedestrians and people riding bikes happens, I think, way more often than fires. And so whatever we can do to keep the street widths at a bare minimum, I think would benefit us as a city. Thank you.
Thanks, Darren. Lots of comments about that section, Renee. Harold, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I want to talk a little bit about the tree piece of this, and I'm going to voice a concern or a prediction without any judgment involved of what's going to happen here. So on a street that's classified as a boulevard, we're strengthening the section about the role of trees. We have the modal hierarchy, which does not include trees, but trees are now included elsewhere. And many of our boulevards have a constrained right-of-way. And so what should, in theory, happen is, we look at the available right-of-way, we look at what needs to be included in terms of travel lanes, terrace space, flex space, bike lanes, transit lanes. And then we're going to find out that most of the time there's not enough right-of-way to put all of that in. And so now I'm wondering what's going to happen. Now, maybe I already have seen what's happening with some of these projects is, well, then we need to start making trade-offs, and the modal hierarchy can guide us to some extent and saying like, well, maybe we remove a travel lane, but then often we've heard like, well, that's not really feasible. It's part of the national highway system. It's a county highway. And so what I predict is going to happen is that we're going to end up with boulevards that will not have safe facilities for people who are not driving, that we're going to continue to have these discussions of like, oh, we need to trade bike lanes for trees, we need to trade sidewalk width for bike lanes or trees, or we can't have a transit lane. So that's a big concern that I have, and I don't think the guide, when we talked about the modal hierarchy, we didn't include the tree issue, but we have come to see that it is something that a lot of people care about a lot with good reason. And so I'm just trying to think through what these changes to the Complete Green Streets guide with regard to tree are going to, what are the consequences, and this what we want those consequences to be.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think theoretically, we should still be following the process of values, modal hierarchy. What are the overlays in terms of priorities? Is this a tree priority? Is it a transit priority? Is it on the all ages and ability? And making those hard decisions. But as we know that trees are not in the modal hierarchy, and even if an area isn't a tree priority area, they can make it challenging to kind of work through the process, make the trade-offs, and get a project that kind of comes out more the way it's intended. So I don't necessarily think that what we're adding is going to make that necessarily more complicated, but I'd love to have the feedback if you feel like this is going to make this job harder to do with any of the additions that were made, or if it will just kind of continue to be the challenge that we're seeing. And maybe there's something that you would like to add to, like, clarify, like, what do we do if it's not a tree priority area and that trade-off needs to come from the trees, right? Is there some language that could clarify kind of how you're envisioning just like making that decision a little bit more clear?
I wish I had a good answer for you, but I don't think I do. But, hearing two people saying like, oh yeah, thanks for these additions, that really focuses that trees are much more important than they were. And I'm paraphrasing here. That's what I'm hearing. And I think that's how people are reading it. And that will then impact the decisions that we make about those trade-offs. But yeah, I'm not sure if there's anything that can be done about that. Maybe at some point we need to do another engagement process around like some of these trade-offs, which I don't think were as explicitly addressed in the public engagement for the Complete Green Streets Guide. I think it was really good. Initially it was the Complete Streets Guide and it was the Complete Green Streets Guide. So we have acknowledged this, but maybe not as we've seen once it comes down to projects on the ground, the debate shifts and yeah, it's different. All right, that's all I had.
Okay, thanks, Harold. Robbie, go ahead.
So these are actually going to be more questions than comments. And speaking of both the fire lane issue and the tree question, I did have a question. Maybe Ian can answer this. Maybe Renee can answer this. I'm not sure. But there was a project not too far from me that was going to convert a one-story building to a multi-story building. And they were going to remove 3 or 4 mature city trees in order to provide aerial fire access. And I was a little outraged that we were just going to allow mature trees that are on city right-of-way to be removed. So I think Chris brought this up with regard to street trees where there are taller buildings, but I'm not sure we necessarily addressed it. What does the fire code say about having larger trees near taller buildings? And I don't know who can answer that, but also, do we have a policy that if, and this might be getting outside of the Transportation Commission, but if the development requires removal of a mature tree on city right-of-way, do we have some sort of offset that is required for that development, either financial or tree planting? Maybe, I don't know if Ian is the person that can answer it, but
I'm going to say, like, I think I'm more familiar with the planting of new trees than the requirements around if trees are taken down. And unfortunately, Bill Sullivan from the fire department wasn't able to make it, but I can definitely note that. And I don't know, Ian, if you have any more familiarity in your time here with trees coming down. I know there are requirements.
Right. And on the fire code piece or the access piece, I have had passing conversations with the fire department about that and how our trees, in a plan would not be prohibited from being planting just in case. But I'm not familiar with what the code says or their access requirements or how that pertains to specific trees on an individual project. We're trying to work with any partners at the table to try and retain the mature canopy that we have. And if we have to lose anything, amending the site at the time that we're turning those plantings over to improving soil conditions, increasing soil volumes, and making it viable as best we can for the long term going forward.
yeah, I mean, here's one where it seems that the loss of mature, and these are not the little stick trees that we see along a lot of places that never get very big. These were actually relatively large trees in the city right of way again. And I was told, now the project, I don't think the project's been approved yet, but I was told during a neighborhood meeting, oh no, those trees have to come down because the building will be more than 30 feet tall, so we need to have aerial access. And I'm like, why are we giving up city trees, mature city trees, in an area that needs them? I guess that was my, and I don't know if we're going to get answers to that, but that I think Chris brought up, what is the relationship between taller buildings and not being able to plant trees, taller trees, because shade trees, I should say, because of access, fire access. So that's kind of something I'd like to find out about. But then teeing off on the fire code issue and the width of the street, we saw several options for providing access, on the public right of way. And one of them, and all of them seem to have relatively wider streets, or things that act as wider streets with no parking, like one of them was 2 lanes, no parking, but each of the lanes is 13 feet wide, which is ridiculously wide for a neighborhood street. And that's going to just encourage people to speed. So my question is there any prohibition that we have bump outs or other provisions that would then slow the traffic speed, but would still provide fire access?
Yes. So I think that's the thing that these streets need to have then, is if we're using one of those styles of streets, then we have to work to ensure the placement of bump outs and things like that to kind of mitigate anything that, any wideness that might need to be at a certain point to allow that fire lane. So yes, it becomes a much more complicated kind of final design.
Okay. But there's nothing in the fire code that says you have to have 26 feet the entire length of the street.
No,
Yeah, okay.
You just have to kind of work to make sure they get the amount that they need. And then you can have those other placements within that street.
Okay. So I guess those were my questions, and I guess I'll just sort of punt on the question of the taller trees and the taller buildings.
Yep.
And what the city might want to do to keep these taller trees if we're going from a 1-story, which does not require aerial access, to a taller building that does require aerial access. And what are we asking in exchange, or how are we prohibiting the loss of those trees on city right-of-way if there is a new building that is going to require aerial access? I really don't want to lose 4. It was either 3 or 4 trees in front of this 1-story building just because they want to build taller. So,
yeah, for sure. And we can definitely circle back around to that with Bill before we come back, because I know, the planting of new trees is something that they can place much more carefully, but I don't know when there is a lot of mature canopy trees, kind of what is required. So we'll come back with that when we return.
Right. And of course, new trees are not going to provide shade that mature trees do. So, okay, thanks. I'm done.
Okay, thanks, Robbie. Chris, go ahead.
Thanks. I guess I'm glad people asked about the tree stuff, because it gave me a chance to look back at the guide and think about the priority areas and the modal hierarchy. This might be a can of worms, but I think there's an opportunity to look again at the modal hierarchy and how it interacts with the priority areas. So one opportunity based on that conversation is how the tree canopy priority area interacts with the modal hierarchy. I think there might be an opportunity, maybe this requires more of a working session or something, but to talk that through. And while that conversation is happening, I think that when the Complete Streets Guide was finally approved, it was sort of a last-minute decision to break out bus and bike separately. I think at one point, I see maybe Harold shaking his head. There might be an opportunity to take another look at that interaction between bus and bike and where that interacts with transit priorities and bike priority areas, and whether the priority areas elevate one or the other. I know it's very controversial, as I can already see on Harold's face, but I think there's a whole conversation there that could happen again.
Well, you're right, Chris. There were extensive conversations about the modal hierarchy, where parking should be, Oh,
that's what was broken out at the last minute.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
everything that you're talking about and how trees interact with that, how equity interacts with that. So I guess, Renee, something for you to think about is, are there some things that you want to come back to TC about, again, for a working session, similar to what you would have done with the Transportation Policy and Planning Board, to revisit the modal hierarchy and how it interacts with the, certainly with the tree canopy priority, and perhaps even with the equity priority as well.
Yeah.
Anything else, Chris?
Yeah, one more trivial one.
Sure.
Renee, you asked about, I think you proposed the walkway zone width. It feels like it's getting a little sloppy to me. So maybe we could think about whether it should be called walk zone, flex zone, travel zone, just to keep things clean and consistent. But you can take that back and see how it works. That's it.
Interesting. Yeah. Alder Tischler. Thanks, Chris. Go ahead, Alder.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was just kind of hanging out in the just watching or listening to this live. Jumped in just to give out thanks. I guess I don't oftentimes do that enough. So just wanted to thank the Transportation Commission and also city staff for the discussion you're having on the tree canopy and just placing importance of trees. I just wanted to make that known. I did have one quick question, because we're getting ready for the West Area Plan, and I'm just going through rereading it right now, and I wanted to just ask one quick question that relates to this topic, because I was looking at the West Area Plan when it talks about the convert a 5-foot wide sidewalk along Regent between North Seago and Eau Claire Avenue. When in the West Area Plan, it talks about widen existing terraces, minimize tree impact. I just wonder if Renee or anybody else, when the West Area planners were writing that, is the thinking that we would just weave around some of the trees along Renabon Park there? Is that what that language is kind of implying there? So I've had a couple of residents who are, of course, concerned about this little stretch of a sidewalk.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty typical thing that, we've done in some projects, is kind of shift over to avoid trees, taking a slightly different alignment to protect trees, making some small areas that might be narrower, or obviously, working with the park to see if we can shift a little bit out of the right of way and into parks land, because the trees are a huge value to the park as well. So it's talking about trying to make those kinds of, kind of design decisions to keep what is also an enhancement for a path, which is tree coverage. So
okay,
it would be trying to do those things in the design.
Okay, great. And also, just Robbie, your suggestion about the bump outs, I think, is an excellent way. I've had a number of residents who've asked the same question, just to increase visibility. Most recently on Rosa Road, they want, because there are a lot of trees, nice fully mature trees, but they wanted to be able to kind of lean out into traffic more to safely cross and see. And so they want to save the trees, but then they were thinking that a bump out would be a way to increase pedestrian crossing on that section. So I just wanted to add that. I will let you guys get back to your meeting, and thanks for letting me just jump in for a little bit. Yeah. Good night, everybody.
Yeah, all relevant comments related to what we're talking about, Alder. So appreciated. Pepe, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Renee, for the presentation. So yeah, I guess I can say that I agree with most of what has been said so far regarding the fire lane and the access to fire as opposing to safety, potentially everyday safety, and the importance of the tree canopy. Although I wanted to make a quick twist to put some focus on the part of equity that you were mentioning at the beginning of the presentation. I agree with you, and that you mentioned that potentially not just the topics that Chris was highlighting, but also equity might be a good one to analyze, because I would like to understand better like what's really the role that the equity areas are playing here, like how big of a role or how impactful that has been so far, because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Renee, and I would love to learn more about like how you see this has been impactful during this couple of years, but it tends to be like it's very easy to fall into being very like reductionist with equity work in terms of like they end up being just a system of points and be like, yeah, it's an equity area, kind of gets like this amount, like X amount of points just because it's an equity area, but that's it. So I don't know, in your perspective, Renee, like projects that have been proposed or are being proposed for equity areas as of now, like what's the real difference, what's the real impact that has made in completing green streets, or is there any room for improvement on that? How can we better highlight those projects or maybe approach them in a different way than just give them more points?
Yeah, so right now I would say we've had five reconstruction projects. None of them have fallen within an equity priority area. So I wouldn't say that we really know how this will work yet. Equity is one of many things that you saw in the tip that helps select projects. So I like to think that we'll know more soon. We know that we don't actually totally know how we want to roll this out. We have some ideas about more engagement, more trying to align budgets, and have had some thoughts on how we would do this. We have, like I said, we're going to be starting a project probably towards the end of this year to kind of better understand how we actually would roll that out when we have projects that are funded. And so I think that you'll be hearing more about that. I think right now our equity priority areas are quite tiny. They're mostly made up of pretty small streets that don't score as high. We tried to think about it a little bit. We had one project that was adjacent. So we tried to kind of think through like not asking people to tell us stuff that they already just told us through a different process, and like trying to make sure we're hearing from planning. What did people tell you? We don't want to force them to come to more meetings to tell us exactly what they told us not that long ago. Definitely the aligning of budgets across the city is a challenge. And we have a lot of thinking around like how to best do that. So I think, with the funds that we have to build upon this initial work, we hopefully are going to come up with a strategy. And then we are going to have, with bigger areas, we're going to have to, because we're going to have a lot more projects that fall into those areas than those tiny, really tiny little dots that we started with. So I don't have a good answer yet. I just know that we have a lot of work yet to kind of roll that out in the intentional way that, we were talking about it and that was in the guide, but isn't fully fleshed out yet. So I would say this is one of the areas that we have a lot of work to do in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with you. Renee, because, many times, even if we intend to put equity in the front, it kind of falls back to the end just because the current systems of just like how we bring projects up to being visible, and which is the original list of projects doesn't start from a place of equity, but instead once we get that list, then we analyze them based on equity instead of analyzing understanding equity as a space where potentially people are not being heard, or the problems there are not being brought to the surface. Then we're not even looking at projects that those projects will never even make it to the list to be analyzed as part of the equity, because it's not part of an area that is a focus to beginning with. So yeah, I appreciate your perspective on that, and I'm really looking forward to see how those efforts around equity continue to evolve and take an important play there here.
Thanks, Pepe. Harold, go ahead.
Thank you. One more thing about tree that's very specific that occurred to me. So with the new section 6.4, you have this language about consider the location of any bus stop, bike parking, and similar items, and how these can be placed to preserve or enhance the tree canopy. One thing that made me think of the bus stop part especially is a lot of cities, maybe not so much in the Midwest, but more in southern areas or in Europe, have started making urban heat plan, shade planning kind of initiatives that take into account that we are dealing with a heating climate where record heat becomes more and more common, and we need to protect people from that, and bus stops being an important place where, if you ever have stood at a bus stop in the blazing heat without shade, you know how important that is. And so I wonder if I assume the language in there is intended to hey, if we need to pour a pad for a bus stop, let's not cut down a tree for that, but maybe we can actually flip this around, and maybe the Complete Green Streets Guide is not the best place. Maybe this is something for the sustainability plan or something else, but acknowledging hey, bus stops are places where we want shade, where we especially want those cooling effects that we get from street trees, and therefore we are intentional about it, which I think often bus stops make sense at intersections, but intersections is also where you need a turn lane, and so there's less space. So I think acknowledging that aspect of the value of trees and how that interacts with bus stops would be something to integrate somewhere.
I think that's great. And I think I'm not an urban heat island expert. I have had a brief conversation with the sustainability team about the topic. And I think that at some point they might bring something forward that could kind of fit within the guide. I'm not aware that they're at that point yet either, but I like your idea about not just think about it so it can enhance or the canopy or not have detrimental effects, but can also provide these other core benefits that are important to people traveling in a multimodal fashion. So I like that. I'm going to give that one some thought before I come back.
Thank you.
Thanks. I don't see any other hands. I have just a couple comments myself. You asked about the project checklist, Renee. I recall a couple of times where by reading through the project checklist, I was able to identify that staff thought TC approval of a variance from Complete Green Streets was required because they worked it through in the checklist. So I think there are portions of the checklist that are very helpful to us, but I'd also be interested in what staff thinks, because I think, and maybe Chris, you suggested this, that we don't want to duplicate. We don't want to make this just like a make work kind of thing. We want to be using it to call out certain things so that it's helpful to everybody and not just a lot of work for everybody. But, there were at least 2 times that I can remember where I didn't realize that we needed to approve a variance, and it was right there in the checklist. So I wanted to bring that forward. And I also wanted to comment on something you said, Harold, thinking about priorities and bringing forward the importance of trees and tree canopy. And we talk about that a lot, but we also talk about safety at the Transportation Commission. And, you know, the Mineral Point widened sidewalk, we had a huge conversation about the importance of safety, and we decided to remove a few more trees in order to make that space safer, in our opinion. So Renee, I think, you know, in that new section, there's a lot of maybes on there. And I think, Harold, that means that we'll continue to have conversations about priorities. And when things come to the Transportation Commission, we're going to need to balance those and make decisions about what we think is of higher priority. So I don't know, Renee, but it seems to me that there's always going to be these conversations about balancing priorities. Although the third comment, Chris, I really like the idea of revisiting the modal hierarchy in terms of how it interacts with the both with the tree canopy priorities or the overlay and the equity overlay, especially with the expansion proposed of the equity overlay, because you know, I'm not sure exactly, and you know, it's been a while since I've totally read through the guide, but where do we talk about how those interact, Renee? And is that something that we should talk about? So is that kind of where you were going, Chris? Okay, yeah. So, you know, it may require another conversation, Renee, to maybe work through some of that. So we can talk about that offline, perhaps. So other comments or questions? A lot of great discussion this evening, as usual. Any other comments for Renee? So it's going to go to Board of Public Works to talk about the tree canopy issues and get their feedback. Perhaps we'll have another conversation or workshop type discussion before we bring back the actual updated guide for approval. Does that sound right, Renee?
Yeah, that sounds good. And we can kind of, in our meetings to get the agenda, we can discuss kind of the time frame for that. That works.
Oh, and there were some questions about for the fire experts, fire marshals.
Yes. Yep, and
Yeah,
we'll bring those back too. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else for the list? Excellent work, Renee. I mean, a huge project, and the idea of waiting 18 months to revisit it, I think, was really worthwhile. To have some actual experience before we look at how it should be revised and updated. Any other last comments for Renee? Okay, thanks so much. Okay, here moving on to the quarterly traffic safety report. Lieutenant Hannah is here this evening.
Good evening.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me tonight. I just want to, and has everyone seen the report? Has everyone gotten that?
Yeah, it was placed in Legistar, so everybody has had access to it, yes.
Fantastic. So I'll share my screen then and we'll go through a few things. And I won't bore you too much with numbers because you can see some of those on your own. But we'll talk about some of the highlights of this quarterly report as we almost are done with quarter 3. But here we are talking about the second quarter of 2024. Again, the numbers that we pull are my PRT pulls this information from data from LERMS and TRAX and all of the other places where we keep all of our data for traffic crashes, citations, warnings, all of that stuff. If you have any questions about any of these numbers, please feel free to get a hold of me. I'm just going to move you all up here. In the second quarter, there were 2 fatality crashes. The following slides will summarize those 2 crashes. The first one we're going to talk about occurred on May 28th at 12:17 p.m. This crash occurred in the 900 block of East Washington Avenue. That is just across from Breeze Stevens Field. If you need a landmark, motor vehicle versus motor vehicle. The driver of a vehicle that was driving inbound on East Washington Avenue had a medical event that led to that driver crossing into the outbound lanes of East Washington Avenue. She then began to drive inbound in the outbound lanes at a high rate of speed, crashing head-on into a vehicle that was traveling outbound. The driver who had a medical event was pronounced deceased at the hospital. The other driver who sustained life-threatening injuries is expected to survive, but she did have terrible, terrible injuries. The driver with the medical event was a 74-year-old white female. She did have her seatbelt on. The airbag did deploy. Unknown if there were drugs or alcohol in her system. I don't have the results of those tests. Again, we have information to lead us to believe that a medical event was the reason for her driving behavior. And the victim in this crash, a 52-year-old white female, again, using her seatbelt, airbags deployed, drugs not suspected, tests not given. She just was unfortunately in the wrong place at the wrong time. Several bad injuries, broken wrists, hip injuries, anything you can imagine that poor woman experienced. Crash number 2 occurred on June 23rd at 4:32 p.m. on Lake Farm Road. So motorcycle versus a motor vehicle. The driver of the motorcycle was traveling at a high rate of speed when he lost control of his motorcycle. That motorcycle came to a curve in the road, crossed the center line, and crashed into the oncoming vehicle. The motorcyclist was pronounced deceased at the scene. The operator of the other vehicle, her human passenger, and her canine passenger were not physically injured. They were coming back from the dog park they were just leaving the dog park that's out there. So the deceased motorcyclist was a 41-year-old white male. He did not have a helmet on. We don't know if there were drugs involved. Right now, it does appear as though he was simply traveling too fast and lost control of his motorcycle. He did have a valid driver's license for both vehicles and motorcycles. And the other driver, 42-year-old white female, like I said, she was not physically injured, nor were her passengers. Both humans had seatbelts on, airbags were deployed, drugs and alcohol were not suspected. She did consent to a test of her blood. And again, she was traveling the speed limit with due regard when this crash occurred. That brings the number of fatalities for the year to 4 through the second quarter, although we have had 2 additional since then. And then we've had 2 very serious crashes recently where the news is becoming a little bit better for those 2 folks. We did believe that we were trending in a bad direction after those 2 most recent crashes, but things do seem to be improving. So I am hopeful that we will not add to that 6. The rest of the stuff, Anne made a great suggestion. I had the grant activity in the middle of the presentation. I've put that at the end so you can peruse that at your leisure. Just a reminder about our grant activity, the number of citations and warnings given. Those citations and warnings do not necessarily reflect what the grant was intended for. We don't write 328 citations for impaired driving grants. Those are most likely speeding grants or red signal violations or something of that nature that gets the attention of the officer and then leads to other things. Once in a while, we do come across a few drunk drivers. I think there was one grant that we ran in the second quarter where they got three impaired drivers in the course of 4 hours, a 4-hour grant, which is absolutely appalling to me and quite incredible. But again, you can see how many deployments we had in the second quarter and then the total of numbers of citations and warnings that were given in the second quarter related to that grant activity. This just shows you, I've mentioned this before, our grant activity, the year is October 1st through September 30. That's the grant year. And so we're just finishing up our grant year at the end of this month. And Matt Meyer from the county just sent over some paperwork today for the next grant year to continue. So once that is all approved by the county board and goes in front of the mayor for approval, we will start our grants up once again, hopefully quickly enough to start them again in October so we don't really skip a beat. There's plenty of work to do out there, that's for sure. So again, I've put the grant stuff at the back. I don't want to bore you with a lot of this stuff, but what I do want to point out is that the officers in the additional information portion of these synopsises, if you will, they talk about things that people say to them while they're doing these grants. And I think it's important to see what people's comments are when they see officers doing these grants in their neighborhoods, how appreciative they are. You get a little bit of a better understanding of why we pick the locations that we pick. We have a couple officers who do a really good job of explaining why they run a ped bike grant in a location. Maybe there's several crosswalks, or maybe it's a school zone. Maybe there was just recently some traffic construction and the road has been reconvened a bit, like Atwood Avenue, I think, is where they like to go right now because that's speed limit over there and all the bike paths, and it's just the speeds over there are quite impressive and unfortunate. You'll see in these grants that the officers usually never write tickets for less than 14 miles over the speed limit. Again, we've talked about this before. People who think that we're pulling people over for 1 or 2 miles over the speed limit, that's just not the case. There's a lot of people that are driving extremely fast, and so we can have a high threshold, and we're still making a lot of stops, which is frightening, but it does give you kind of an idea of the leeway that we're giving people. So we're kind of going against that message that we're out there kind of being, I guess, piddly about some of the things that we're stopping people for. These are genuinely dangerous driving behaviors that we're focusing on. Does anyone have any questions about any of this?
Yeah, comments or questions for Lieutenant Hannah? One thing that I have a question for all of you. There are a lot of slides at the end, which has a lot of really interesting information about the results of the traffic grants that she's talking about here. And I'm curious if you find that useful. I mean, there's like 50 slides, so it's a lot of work for her. And I found it really interesting. And I just wanted to make sure everybody else finds it valuable and interesting as well. Alder Govindarajan, go ahead.
Thank you. I do find it interesting, just to answer your question. Thank you. I wanted to ask a question, Lieutenant, about the pedestrian/bike citations. Can you share more about like what kind of actions result in those citations?
Sure. Actually, I think that name is maybe a little bit misleading. Those grants are actually bicycle and pedestrian safety grants, which means we are not focused on what pedestrians or bicyclists are doing wrong. We are focusing on vehicles and driving behavior that is making it unsafe for pedestrians and bicyclists. Does that explain it a little bit better?
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much.
Yep, of course.
Thanks, Alder. Harold, go ahead.
Sorry, it took me a second to put the unmute button. I guess in regard to your question, Anne, I mean, I browsed through all the slides and I did find them interesting, but I find many things interesting. So I think maybe my take is it depends on how much work it is to put together, because I'm sure, Lieutenant, you have a lot of tasks to do. And so if this is an inordinate amount of work, then maybe we can condense this down a little bit. But otherwise, it is interesting.
That's very kind of you. I don't mind doing this because I think it's important. And I think just the scope of it is really, it's just really eye-opening. It really puts a story with some of these numbers and kind of explains a little bit better about what's going on out there. So don't worry about me. It's a lot of work, but it really is important to me because I think this is, it's just, there's a lot of bad driving out there. And I think we really need to make sure that we're on top of it because, we're losing too many people in manners that we shouldn't be. People are driving very, very recklessly, and it's unfortunate right now.
Yeah, you can see that in the grant activity. Robbie, go ahead.
So sorry,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Did you have more, Harold? Go ahead.
yes. Yeah, two other questions or comments. Let's start with the question. So most of what you have in here is about speeding, because I understand this is like related to test grants, and speed is a huge factor in many crashes. Another thing that I observe myself, that I hear from other people, is red light running, and that can take many forms or shapes. Like it can be the blatant, like, light has been solid red for 5 seconds and people just blast through, or it's the flying right on red where people don't stop before turning right on red. Do you do anything that's focused on that, or?
We do. Sometimes it's very difficult to set up, and like, we see them all the time, right? When we drive and we're like, where are the cops? I mean, I see it every morning when I drive in from Sun Prairie and see everybody whipping past me, even though I'm in a cop car and driving through red lights. And I'm just as frustrated. It is hard to kind of get a group of people in line and ready to do these kinds of citations without kind of blowing our cover a little bit, if that makes sense. When I was a patrol officer, it's easy to do that when you're by yourself and you're kind of tucked away a little bit. And I would have my camera focused on East Wash and Baldwin. That was my favorite intersection. Caught it on camera every time, and they wouldn't see me. So when you're doing grant activity, I mean, you know how it is when you see a police officer. What's the first thing you do is you slam on the brakes because, oh my gosh, there they are, right? It's just that it's natural. So it's very hard to set up a group of people, 6 officers, who are trying to find just that specific violation. We know speeding. We know speeding has a lot of implications, right? I mean, it's absolutely dangerous. And that's something that we can capture relatively easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, that enforcement in this case is really hard to achieve. And so we have to think about, and this is maybe something that Division Zero folks like Renee, maybe you should think about, like, what can we do? I mean, I also think that probably public information campaigns are probably also not super effective in like reminding people, like, yes, you may be allowed to turn on red, but you really got to stop and you got to look in both directions. So I'm not sure what the solution is. Thank you for that. And then I guess the other thing, the final thing, was just an observation, and I don't know if other people in the commission there was some reporting in the New York Times about changes in traffic enforcement since the pandemic in different US cities. And so I'm looking at your chart of the number of citations, and it seems like basically our citations now are pretty similar to what they were before the pandemic. Is that right?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. During the pandemic era, we did give a lot of leeway just because, nobody wanted to have contact with anybody. Unfortunately, traffic enforcement was one of the first things that went away. I mean, people were financially strapped. We didn't want to come into contact with someone that maybe was sick. And so people got into some bad habits. And now we are ramping up back again and focusing on those hazardous violations, those bad habits that people got into during that time period.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. We will see what effect that has. Hopefully it will help to remind people that, don't do this. It's killing people. Right.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thanks, Harold. Robbie, go ahead.
Yeah, I also find this extremely useful, and I appreciate having the information. I'm kind of appalled at how bad some of the behavior is, by the speeds and things like that. I would just make sort of 2 observations about locations that you repeatedly went to. And one was the East Washington at the interstate.
Yes.
We had the possible new configurations of the exits before us because WSDOT is going to rebuild the interstate. They wanted our opinion. And one of the things that we tried to emphasize was that we want people to slow down when they're coming off of the extension of 151, or when they're coming off the interstate, to emphasize that they are entering a city. And I think that your experience with people in that area really illustrates why that's so important, because people are just, I don't know if they're coming off the interstate exit or if they're coming in from Sun Prairie or what, but they're just flying. You know, they are not slowing down as they come onto East Washington.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, because so I live in Sun Prairie and I drive 151 in all the time. And one of the reasons why that location is a place that we focus on is because if you've ever noticed in the afternoon, if you're ever driving towards Sun Prairie, you'll see the backup of cars looking to get onto the interstate to go to the west, to get to the West Belt Line, we'll say, or that direction, right? The westbound Belt Line. And that line is always backed up so far, and it's always backed up in the morning during rush hour and at night. And so when we're focusing our grants at that time, we're getting all of that traffic backup. We're seeing all of that. What we're also seeing is a large number of crashes that are occurring because people are coming maybe over a hill, or they're traveling too fast and they don't realize that everybody is backed up. And then they cruise into the next lane because they've realized, you know, that, oh my gosh, everyone stopped. And what a hazard that creates for someone who might be traveling in that middle lane at 55 miles an hour, when somebody who's in the right lane is realizing that they are all of a sudden approaching stop traffic and then go into that lane. That whole area really needs a revision. I mean, those ramps, they're not big enough. They don't give people enough time to accelerate or slow down. And then you get this line, and the number of crashes every day in that area. And I know a lot of people work at American Family, or there's a lot of people in Sun Prairie that maybe need to work on the west side. And so those lines are always so long, and they're just so dangerous with those speeds. And I'm actually surprised that the 55 mile an hour speed limit goes as far as it does into the city there, if you've ever noticed that.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what WSDOT comes up with, because I don't think that they took our advice on how to reroute traffic so that they wouldn't just be focused directly in on East Washington. But we'll see. That's their highway, and we'll see what they come up with. But I guess that was just a comment. And also, of course, that I would say East Washington is probably there's going to be a lot of redevelopment going on, and probably a lot more density, and probably a lot more people using transportation modes other than driving, which means that they're going to have to cross East Washington and operate along East Washington. And, you know, we really need that to be more of an urban situation than a highway. So again, that's what we wanted WSDOT to not just encourage people to come flying in to East Washington at highway speeds. So
yeah, I mean, you have East Washington Avenue is one of our highest, crash locations, the whole darn road. And now you've got a new traffic project, the BRT, and who knows what that might create for drivers who are maybe not understanding fully what this means, and already are traveling too quickly, and so there's a lot going on in East Washington Avenue, and so that's why it's one of the reasons we focus on that whole stretch. We know that a lot of people crash on East Wash. There's a lot of dynamics on East Washington Avenue, a lot of things to pay attention to, and so it is one of our major focuses.
And the other location that I noticed was South Park Street, which we have a lot of pedestrians there, a lot of non-drivers. It's another place where we're going to have BRT soon, and it's another state highway where we are going to need the approval of WSDOT, and yet we see these really high speeds, and it just shows that not just enforcement, but engineering comes into this, and roadway design, to make it more of an urban situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit it on the head. Park Street is very heavily, pedestrian. And last week's crash, maybe it was last week or the week before, with the young lady on Park and Olin, simply in the crosswalk crossing and is hit by a car making a left turn from Park. We know that there's a lot of pedestrians out there, and it is actually another reason why we focus on those areas. Plus, there's a couple schools over there, Wright School, and I think one of the new grade schools is over there now. And so, there's a lot of people on foot. We need to pay attention to that for them.
Right. So the final point I was going to make was regarding red light running. Many years ago, probably, maybe even 15, 20 years ago, I was part of a sort of, I guess you'd say, an informal study with the public health department on red light running. We were trying to gather data to encourage the state, the legislature, to allow red light cameras. And what they did was, with the help of the police department, they would have an officer watch a particular intersection and note the type of car and license plate of somebody who ran a red light, and then they would just phone ahead to a patrol car that was like a block down. Mm-hmm. And that person would chase him down. If you wanted to if there was a particular location where you have really serious red lights running, we did this at University Avenue and University Bay Drive. We also did it at Regent and Park Street. Those were the two that I participated in. It was just unbelievable how many people were running red lights at those two intersections. But that was one way to do it. But I'm not going to tell you how to do your job.
And I appreciate that.
That's a way that can be done, is to have somebody a block down to stop the red light runners.
So. Yes, and we haven't done that in a bit because the construction on East Washington Avenue has really kind of hurt our enforcement, if you will. There's so many construction sites, and it's kind of like the Beltline. I usually tell my folks to try not to run traffic on the Beltline because it is so extremely dangerous, and there's no good place to pull over a vehicle without putting yourself in dire straits. East Washington Avenue lately, with all of the construction, with all of the lane closures, it is very hard to run traffic sometimes if the location isn't, under construction. We really have to take that in consideration as well. But yes, that is absolutely how we can do that. And once things get settled down and the lanes are back open and we can do that safely, because we do have to worry about our actions and how they affect other drivers as well. So if we can do that safely on some of these roads, you bet we're going to do that.
Okay, well, thanks for the information and thanks for your efforts, because obviously you've got a lot of people coming up to you and telling you thank you for being out there. I'm sure there's lots of people who didn't even come over and say that, but they appreciate it.
Yeah, we hear it a lot, and it's quite nice. So we know we're doing good things. We know they appreciate it, and so we're just doing our part.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Robbie. Alder Martinez Rutherford, go ahead.
Yeah, Lieutenant Hannah, thank you a million for this. I have noticed and gotten information on certain grants that we're running in my district, and particularly I'm thinking about Atwood, and for a newly designed street that is geared towards a lot of pedestrian and bike infrastructure in the area. It's really disturbing how much that happens.
Yes.
And then on Milwaukee and Stoughton, so a lot of it is kind of in my district, and just knowing how many of my loved ones and friends walk through that area and use their bikes frequently, I just really wanted to acknowledge the work and say thank you so much, and thank you so much for all this information that you give to us quarterly. It's so helpful.
Thank you.
And enlightening. So,
thank you.
Also I feel like I have a twisted fascination with it too.
Well, I think, sometimes numbers don't mean anything, right? But if you have a story behind it, it makes a lot more sense and it's much more compelling. So thank you for that. And I think they actually just ran a grant today over in that same area because of the speeds they're seeing in that new configuration, which are shocking to me as well.
I'm glad I took a different direction.
Yes, that's right.
Thanks, Alder. Any other comments for Lieutenant Hannah? Pepe, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Lieutenant Hannah, for this presentation and all the work done. I can only echo everybody else's comments here, if you may. I apologize for the toddler shouts in the background. They're gonna be here.
No worries, no worries.
Yeah, and I don't know, and this is, it's maybe a little bit of frustration, or something. Yeah, I don't. It's not really a comment maybe specifically for you, but I have transitioned into the sometimes fortunate, sometimes unfortunate reality of commuting by car from commuting by bike for many years. And coming from the bicycle and pedestrian advocacy world, I'm very aware of speeds. And I find really disturbing how when I try to drive speed limit, I essentially feel like a hazard. Like I literally feel like a post in the middle of the highway compared to how fast people drive next to me. It's just unbelievable. It becomes dangerous. I feel like I need to speed up because it becomes really dangerous, to drive speed limit. Very specifically talking about the belt line. I have to take the belt line every day, morning and afternoon, and yeah, it's so what can we do? I mean, I understand that we have limited resources, and we're looking at this presentation right here, and you say lowest speed is kind of like 14 miles per hour over, and that even gives you enough work, but yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to repeat myself, but that's kind of the feeling that I'm going through.
I don't like to drive on the Beltline either because I think it's dangerous. I don't know what to do about that beast. It does, like I said, it doesn't lend itself really to do any quality enforcement because that is dangerous for our officers. But I drive the Beltline as well and feel like, is it better for me to keep up with traffic or should I drive the speed limit? Right? You're in this dilemma, this conundrum. So I understand what you're saying, and I wish that I knew what the answer was. I know that the State Patrol focuses quite a bit on the Beltline. They've got a plane and they can do things like that a little bit better than we can. But there's no good way to pull somebody over, and that flex lane is, in my opinion, one of the worst things that ever was built. But what do you do? What do you do? I feel your pain because I go through it myself and I avoid the Beltline whenever I can for the same reasons.
Well, I appreciate you sharing the concern, and I know it's probably a very well-known concern around the the enforcement community. But just wanted to voice that out, and maybe eventually, years from now, or who knows how soon, we can collectively come up with something.
I agree.
Over there.
We do have an officer that focuses, if he works a Sunday, he'll focus on the Beltline, and he's pulled over a few that have actually made the newspaper or the news stories of going 100+ miles an hour. So, I mean, that's his mission, to slow people down who are going that fast on a Sunday morning. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Pepe. Anybody have any other comments for Lieutenant Hannah? And I'm glad to hear everybody else finds the detailed information useful. And I'm guessing, Lieutenant, that all non-Transportation Commission alders find this information useful as well. So anybody have any last comments before we move on? Okay, and before long, we'll see you back with the reporter.
For sure. And I just want to say again, if there's information that this report is lacking, that you have questions about or things that you want to see in this report, please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have specific questions, especially the alders for your specific neighborhoods. I'm more than happy to talk to you about some things that we can do for your constituents in your areas. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, thank you so much. Next, we have updates from members of other BCCs. Anybody have any updates for us tonight? Chris.
I just wanted to let folks know that Plan Commission recommended approval of the West Area Plan and the Northeast Area Plan. One thing I wanted to flag, though, with the Northeast Area Plan, there was something that came up. The plan recommends extension of Nakusa Trail Road along the edge of the park there. Folks can look where that is if they want. Apparently, that came to a bunch of people's attention very recently since it came to Transportation Commission, and there was a lot of opposition to that. So Plan Commission almost recommended removing that extension from the plan, but decided to instead, the plan make a recommendation that the city preserve the right to consider that extension in the future.
Okay. Thank you. Other comments for the group? Harold.
Yeah, brief report from Board of Public Works. One thing that we have seen here at the Transportation Commission, I think, is related to the Pheasant Branch Greenway enhancements, which is this big project, which is maybe majorly a flood mitigation project, but also includes some new multi-use paths out in that area, out where DMV used to be. So Board of Public Works approved the plans and specifications for that. So that's going to move forward quickly.
Okay, great, thanks. Other updates? Okay, thanks so much. Relative to announcements, the mayor made a recommendation to reappoint Bill for a 1-year term as a second alternate and Harold to a 3-year term as a resident member, and those are scheduled for action at the next Common Council meeting on September 10th. And we still have one vacancy since Nikki Vandermeulen chose to step back from TC. And that's all I had in terms of announcements. Unless anybody had any other announcements. Okay. Relative to suggestions for future agenda, Alder Govindarajan is going to make a presentation on the 2025 operating budget for the city at our next meeting, and we have preliminary meeting dates for 2025, review of transportation projects for 2025, and possibly a couple of other things. Anybody have any future agenda topics that you would like to see considered that aren't on the list already? Harold.
Yeah, I was going through my notes recently and I was reminded that I don't even remember when this was, maybe last year or maybe even 2 years ago. There was an agenda item about Metro's transit advertising policy and all that stuff. And I know I think we deferred it or didn't come to us at some point and it never reappeared. So I was wondering if that is something that at some point should return.
Yes, it actually was on as a potential for September 18th, but last I heard, I think, Eric, you were going to be pushing that back a bit. Is that right? Is Eric still on?
Yeah, that's, I think, not something that's been urgent. There's a lot going on at Metro.
Right.
And and particularly because we're not, running ads on the 60-foot buses. I mean, there isn't anything new there, so we're just kind of letting that be where it is. It might be nice to amend, but I mean, ultimately, maybe the I mean, that's a decision that is sort of a more of a long-term decision than something we would do in the middle of BRT and all the other various project implementations. So maybe that'll happen sometime next year. I would have to defer to leadership on that.
Yeah. But interestingly, it was slated for next meeting, and at the last agenda meeting, people said, well, maybe not right now. So, okay, but it is on the list. So other future agenda topics. Okay, seeing none, we need a motion to adjourn. Carl?
Move adjournment.
And Robbie?
Second.
Okay, I'm going to assume a unanimous consent vote. And thanks, everybody. A lot of great discussion again tonight. So we'll see you next time. Thanks.